Yeah, so thank you again for coming on to the podcast. And as I was telling you before we got started, and I'll go ahead and say it again just for the people listening. Yeah, a lot of, at least in my personal opinion, a lot of information in academia seems to be stovepiped. Sometimes it's kind of hard for people on the outside of an academic setting to get access to some of the materials that we work with or some of the information. And so that's why I'm excited to have you on here, and I appreciate you taking the time to do it.
Well, thank you. And I
Um,
appreciate what you're saying about that. For me, a big interest or priority has always been to make information that's usually hard to find easier to find. Because, I mean, it's not my information, right? I don't feel possessive about it exactly. It's like if I can be a conduit to information for other people, that's what I want to be. Um, Outside of particular intellectual property concerns, like this publication of this specific translation or edition is mine. Information about a language or about a myth, that's 1,000 years old is something that I'm always trying to kind of get out there and not have behind some kind of paywall or password or something like that. Just because I think that the more that stuff is locked away, the more what isn't locked away is potentially wrong or misleading, whether intentionally or not. So I've been trying for some time to make just as much of that stuff that's locked up in the ivory tower out in the open.
yeah, no, I like that imagery there, the ivory tower. Uh, that's definitely, I can see why you use that. Well, today I thought it would be interesting. It's not the very typical Old Norse or Viking subject, but it is what you did your dissertation on, which was color in Old West Norse. And so, I guess just to start, my initial question is why the interest?
Oh, well, like a lot of grad students, you should probably ask my advisor why the interest, right? Uh, you know, I think most good theses and dissertations are the result of some back and forth between you and your advisor. I am not sure that I would want to see what I had done with a thesis or dissertation topic I had come up completely with on my own. Um, Maybe vice versa too. But my advisor for my doctorate at the University of Wisconsin, Kirsten Wolf, was was and still is very interested in color terms, and she had been influenced by the work of Carol Bigham on the color terms of Old English. Carol Bigham has at least two books, maybe there's more now, but when I was working on this 15 years ago to 10 years ago, she had two books, Blue in Old English and Gray in Old English, one of which I think is actually her dissertation. And she had looked at all the different, well, she had taken all the occurrences of any term that could possibly mean gray or any term that could possibly mean blue in Old English, made a big database with every data point she could to compare about them and tried to figure out what do these terms mean. And, is one more poetic? Is one used for a certain referent more than others? Is one the actual salient term that leaps to an Old English speaker's brain when they see something new that's blue or gray? These are all questions that are difficult to answer if you just look at a dictionary and see, oh, this term is defined as blue, this term is defined as gray. And she was also trying to work this into a pretty well known framework in linguistics of basic color terms, which has a particular meaning within linguistics. The basic color terms of a language are the color terms to which speakers reduce all other color terms. So in English,
Hmm.
crimson, scarlet, vermilion are not basic color terms because speakers consider them still part of red. So when you get down to the color terms that speakers do not consider part of any others, those are your basic color terms in a language. And The initial research on that was pioneered by Brent Berlin and Paul Kay in the late 1960s. And they had theorized that all languages have at least two basic color terms, roughly black and white. Um, I hold with later research that suggests that really there's no language that has fewer than three. There's always at least a black, white, and a red. I've never seen a convincing case for a language that doesn't have a red term. Um, and potentially, in principle, there's kind of an infinite number of basic color terms you can have, although at the high end, languages tend to have uh, maybe the low teens. So most speakers of English will reduce all their color terms to 10 or 11. Um,
Okay.
and Berlin and Kay famously proposed that there's actually a sequence in which languages acquire color terms. So, they'll start with black and white, and then they'll get red, and then they'll get yellow or green, and then they'll get the one they didn't develop with yellow or green, and then they get blue. Over time, just because in their initial research, they had found that languages that had, say, four color terms will always have black and white, and then yellow and green. And then if they have five, then they add blue. So they thought that this was maybe like a sequence in which languages developed that.
Okay.
Over time, already by the 70s, Paul Kay and associated scholars had seen that the sequence doesn't always hold because there's languages that are missing colors you would expect if they have, like a language that has blue but then doesn't have yellow or green or something like that. So Kay and associated scholars continued to try to adjust this framework to accommodate languages with other sets. Personally, I'm skeptical that this sequence exists at all. Um, I think that the black, white, red as the three minimum is solid, but I don't see that there's much evidence that there's any particular sequence that languages have to follow because there's a pretty wide diversity of basic color terms in language, and also languages lose color terms. Um, there's
Okay. So, what's do you have an example of that? That's very
yeah,
interesting.
there's I can't remember what it is, but there are dialects of Italian that have lost a basic color term that's otherwise present in Italian.
Very
And
interesting. Okay.
again, it's not that people part of what I always do when I'm trying to explain this to people, if you know I'm at a party and trying to explain this, which of course the joke is that I'm never invited to parties. Um, but if I'm
Yeah.
trying to explain this to someone, just sort of on the fly, so I'll pick two things that are within the same basic color term for English. So, like looking around me now, if you look at a little bit of turquoise
Hmm.
and you look at this denim shirt, like probably, I'm going to put words in your mouth, but probably if I ask you what basic color term the turquoise is and what basic color term the denim is, you'll say blue for both.
Yep.
But they're not exactly the same,
No.
right? You can
Exactly.
recognize the difference. So,
Hmm.
speakers of whatever language, if they're not blind or colorblind, recognize the same differences between shades or hues. It's just a question of how they categorize them. So in English, we're categorizing both of these hues as blue, but they don't have to both be categorized as blue. So in Russian, those are actually in two different categories. What we would refer to as light blue and dark blue are two different categories in Russian, sini and goluboy or something like that. I don't really speak Russian, but just as an example. Or then Hungarian has a similar distinction between what we would call light red and dark red, but they're not the same category.
Oh,
So you can split the differences different ways, but still perceive the differences. So that sounds strange to us if we think of a language that has fewer color terms than English. So traditionally spoken Irish and Welsh didn't distinguish blue and green as different categories, right? But they could still talk about blue. They could still talk about green, right? It's just that they have to use some kind of modification to the term that's shared between the two, which I think is gloss in Welsh. So, for example, sky gloss would be blue, grass gloss would be green. So they're still
Right.
perceiving and talking about the same difference. It's just a matter of how it's categorized. So, anyway, part of what went into the beginning of my research was my advisor was pretty committed to the Berlin and K framework, and particularly the notion that color terms were developed in a certain order. And I thought that this distorted our ability to figure out how Old Norse categorized color, because I thought if we're trying to fit it into a framework without just trying to figure out what these terms are used for to begin with, then we may be missing that there's actually something different here that we don't expect. Um, and I thought that in particular, early on, one thing that seemed strange to me was um, trying to shoehorn a basic color term for yellow into Old Norse when they barely ever talk about a yellow category. So what I did was I went through and read pretty much everything anyone has ever heard of in Old Norse, and I made um, paper index cards initially because that was what my advisor wanted me to do, with every occurrence of a color term, where it was, um, whether it was used in poetry, and then if it alliterated or rhymed with some other word that was there, because then maybe it's being chosen just because of poetic reasons and not because it's the normal word you would use. Um,
Right.
this all took years and years and years, during which I was doing a lot of other things too. But I just built up this enormous database. And then, I can't interview Old Norse speakers. I can interview modern Scandinavian language speakers, and maybe get a sense of um, where the system eventually led. But of course, modern languages are so influenced by industrial standards of color production. We all use the same paints, we all have the same pixels on the same computers. Yet modern languages aren't a very good guide to even color categories 100 years ago. So I was kind of just trying to figure out, what color terms occur enough, right, often enough that they're obviously basic, or somewhere something is said that suggests that it's a basic color term because someone says it's not this, it's this color, or it's this kind of this color. Like you look for things like, what are they making compounds with, right? If you can say light X or dark X, then it's more likely to be a basic color term because it's the first term that comes to mind, and they're just modifying it to try to encapsulate some shade of difference. Or if they use proverbial or semi-proverbial sayings about it, as X, right? So in English, when we say as X is X with a color term, those are basic color terms, right? As white as snow,
Like black is
yeah, black as
pitch.
pitch, yeah,
Okay. Yeah. White
red
is
as
no.
blood. Those are basic color terms because we have like these sort of best examples, these focal points for them.
Hmm.
And in fact, one thing that's kind of interesting is that although I don't believe in the universal sequence in which color terms are developed, there is an interesting psychological, if I can say that, not being a psychologist, salience to particular places on the color map where you are very likely, if you have a basic color term for, say, blue, it's very likely to have a very similar focal point to other languages' focal points for blue. So speakers of languages that have a blue term, even if the languages aren't related, probably will agree roughly on what like the best example of blue is. So that's kind of interesting. Um, red tends to be blood, um, unsurprisingly. Green tends to be grass or some other uh, growing thing. Well, so I looked for all this stuff, and eventually, after years and years and years doing many other projects uh, at the same time, because actually the 3 last years of working on my dissertation, I was full time faculty at UCLA, and I was also translating the Poetic Edda and everything else. So these were busy years, but I eventually came up with um, some conclusions, among which was that there is in fact no basic color term for yellow in Old Norse. Um, this is sort of disguised by the fact that the term that becomes the basic color term in modern Scandinavian languages is there, gulr, Gulr. That becomes, Icelandic gulur, Norwegian gul, etc., which means yellow. But in Old Norse, it's only used for hair, and it's not even the most common term for blonde hair. Um, so that's coming in later. It always seems like what we would call yellow, they call red. Um, so I think that's behind, for example, the famous red gold. But you also notice if you go through and you look at everything,
Yeah.
the yolk of an egg is red, the sun is red. Um, so things that we would call yellow are by default called red. And
Well, right now we're reading in my Poetic Edda class, we're reading Volundarkvida, and it keeps mentioning this red
yeah,
gold. And
yeah, to them
yeah,
to them
so
it's
what?
red, right? It's not that they're seeing it differently; it's they're categorizing what they're seeing differently. Um,
Hmm.
if they talk about gold that is less good one way or another, what's interesting is they use the term that I think is the closest thing to meaning yellow in Old Norse, which is bleikar. Um, bleikar. So like if we look at sort of what the red category is doing in Old Norse, you have rauðar, right? Modern Icelandic red. The focal color there is blood, right? If you say as red as, right, sem recht sem, it's going to be blood, recht sem blod.
Hmm.
Um, but red color, the category actually covers the entire warm end of the spectrum. So if something is orange or yellow, it's still in that red category. So just like, again, they see yellow, they can distinguish it from red, but just like we don't distinguish a category between light blue and dark blue, they're not distinguishing a yellow category from a red category. So
I see.
what's interesting then is just like in English, I could say as blue as the deep sea, or I could also say as blue as turquoise, and those being different things. They can also say as red as gold. So it's sort of nascently a new category. Like they're really interested in the color of gold, but they have not yet assigned this a new term. And
Wow.
when they have to distinguish yellow from red, they say bleker, which they don't do very much, but sometimes you do need that contrast. And usually that term occurs in contrast with red. Um, and that seems to be nascently the yellow. Well, actually, really what it is, I think, is it's the non-red warm colors, which explains why it has meanings that mostly shade toward just pale on the continent. But if you notice in modern Icelandic, it means pink,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So it's but it's yellow if you use it of horse. So in modern
Huh.
Icelandic, it still kind of covers the same range. Where what do yellow and pink have in common is that they're not red, but they're warm. So I think that's kind of nascently a basic color term in Old Norse that never really became a basic color term in the descendant languages, except I guess it is the basic color term in Icelandic for pink. But that's not a situation that we would have expected just based on this sequence. We would have expected there to be a really solid yellow category, but I don't see a solid yellow category at all. Again, not to say that they don't see it; they just don't categorize it differently.
But it's just based, and this is also just based on the fact that what we have extant is the Old West Norse, like written manuscripts, and so that's basically the information that we have and that we're trying to make sense of.
Yeah, and
Like,
you have to just deal with what's there, obviously, but what's there does have enough variety. There's nonfiction texts, there's fiction texts. They talk about flowers, they talk about other things in the natural world. You have to be kind of careful sometimes with anything that's domesticated, whether a plant or an animal, because the appearance of this thing can change a lot over time. But
mm,
more or less, basically, if we call it yellow, they are by default going to call it red. But if they have to distinguish it from red, they're going to say Blaker. Um, and I wouldn't have expected that. I don't. I know my advisor didn't expect it, and I didn't expect it either. But then on the other end of the color spectrum, something else that might be considered unexpected by people because there's this really popular actually in Old Norse studies that actually there's no term for blue in Old Norse because
Mm,
blor, blaur, is used of ravens, but it's used of ravens in poetry. In prose, they're called svartar, typical term for black. And
well, yeah,
you may note, if you've ever been close to a raven, that they are, in fact, pretty blue, right? I mean, they shine
love
blue.
them.
So to me, that's not at all evidence they don't have a term for blue because they call blue things that we call blue, right? They distinguish blue eyes from black eyes, which is probably roughly what we
Right.
call blue eyes from brown eyes. Um, they talk about the blue sky, the blue sea, um, blue clothing, which in fact, um, Vikings are described wearing blue clothing by writers in languages that we know do have blue terms, Celtic and Romance languages. And I just don't see a reason to say that blor doesn't mean blue in Old Norse. It's just that poetically they're observing that ravens are, in fact, blue. And if you don't look at ravens a lot, it's like, oh, well, that's crazy. Ravens are black, not blue. But in fact, if you look at ravens pretty closely, they are as blue as this shirt in certain way. So I think that I think that my counter expected results of the study were there's no yellow category, but there is a blue category.
And how have you seen this reflected in translations? And I know you've done several translations yourself. Um, have you sort of kind of added your spin on your translations based on this dissertation and the research that you did and what you discovered?
Yeah, all of my published translations post date this work, so I always translate blår as blue, which is not the majority position. If you look at the complete sagas of Islanders, they always translate blår as black, um,
Hmm.
which I think is unfortunate because it means that you're losing a distinction that's there in the original text. Um, sometimes translators, including in that series, can be so finicky about translating terms differently just because they're different in Old Norse. It's like, well, why not say blue words? Like why
Yeah.
merge these terms? I think another reason they do is that sometimes in the sagas, men seem to pointedly dress in blue before they go and kill someone, and so there's this notion that like, oh well, they must be wearing black because they're going out to kill, But that's our cultural assumption. I think they're dressing to kill, as it were. Right? Blue tends to be a very high status color. It's apparently a fairly expensive dye. So I think they're just putting on their good clothes because murder is a pretty public act in the sagas. Um, there,
Yeah, you don't want to hide
yeah,
it.
right, because then it's murder as opposed to a killing, which can be morally and legally justified. Some translators have accepted my conclusions. The most notable is William Ian Miller, who, of course, is a great scholar of the law and the sagas. And he has his translations. Well, his translation of Hrakfil Saga, he accepts my conclusions about blue, and in this commentary on some other works. So I convinced him. I don't know if I convince anybody else. Uh, I have all the influence of a box turtle. So, uh, but I do translate blue as I do translate blower as blue, and typically translate Blaker as yellow because it's usually the non-red warm color that they mean. Although, I'll go with pink if the context makes it clear that that's the non-red warm color that they mean because it's both. As odd as it sounds to us, there's a color term that means yellow and pink in Old Norse.
Yeah, it sort of gives it, at least me hearing you talk about it, it gives sort of a sense of paleness
Yeah, it's
to
it's
it.
non-red warm, right?
Yeah.
So if we think of red as like optimal warm color, it's suboptimal warm color. Um, that's I mean, we just don't have any categories that are too much like this. I guess like we have some non-basic terms that can kind of work like this. Like sometimes for a really quote unquote weak blue, people will say something like aqua, right?
Yeah.
So I think that it's sort of like the aqua to their red. It's like, well, it's red, but it's not, like a quote unquote good red. It's not a good example of red. It's some other warm color.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's like seeing the difference between gold and pyrite, fool's gold, or something. I can kind
Well,
of
that's actually fairly similar
see
looking.
the.
I mean, as I see pyrite pretty often. It's pretty common around here. Um, and I've also, from time to time, been lucky enough to find little flakes of gold. I totally get how you confuse them. Um, but it's no, it's more like just how are you categorizing this color space, and it's just a somewhat unfamiliar way of doing it from our perspective. But
What about Snorri's Edda? So I'm gonna just read like a small little excerpt from Anthony Fox's translation here. Then Hai replied, laughing, "That's not an intelligent question. Has no one ever told you that the gods built a bridge to heaven from earth called Bifrost? You must have seen it. Maybe it is what you call the rainbow. It has three colors. Can you talk about
aren't the three
that
colors
in a rainbow
just?
heaven?"
Does he say they're red, green, and blue?
Let's see what he says right after, because I have it
I
pulled
can't
up.
remember if he says that it's red, green, and blue, or if that's just the conclusion that I came to because of that's how they break up that color space.
Yeah, right after he doesn't say anything. However, um, in your dissertation, I have it actually pulled up. I can share the screen real quick. Uh, let's see. No, it's awesome. I love how, yeah, you said, you sat there and you wrote all these flashcards and stuff, and it's really cool because the way that your dissertation is mapped out is
So,
really just quite
and
extensive.
anybody can go and find this. By the way, if anyone wants to look for that dissertation, if you just want to, if you've tried everything, if melatonin doesn't work, if trazodone doesn't work, if Unisom doesn't work, and you just have to get to sleep, my dissertation is publicly available. I think at the University of Wisconsin site, maybe at the University of Colorado site still. I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, so part of the rainbow is rather. I mean, I can pull this up too. So, I
Yeah.
I think it's yeah. I just can't remember if
And this may go into what you were talking about at the beginning with, yeah, um, these liter colors.
okay here. Yeah, litir is color in Old Norse. Colors litor singular. Um, yeah, I see where he says this. Thater þú ser rautt í bóknum elder brennandi, where you see red in the rainbow that's burning fire. Okay, so it specifies red. I don't think it specifies the other color terms. Um, but by my theory of how color is broken down in Old Norse, you look at the rainbow and you see space that's covered by three categories. So we see, as English speakers, and actually, I would actually even say this is not true of all English speakers, but it's classically broken down into the Roy G. Biv, right? Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. I would actually say for most
Right.
English speakers, indigo and violet are not basic enough. I would just call that the purple part, right? So where
Yeah.
we're seeing red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and I'm just going to say a hot take purple, we see six. They're seeing three because red, orange, yellow are all red category, and then green is its own category. Green is prominent enough in Old Norse. We see it all the time. It's a basic color term.
Hmm.
And then blue also colors the purple, the indigo and violet side. So in principle, you could look at the rainbow and see 100 different colors if your language categorized that as 100 colors. Our language categorizes that as
Right.
six or seven. Their language just categorizes what they see there as three. So I think it actually works out perfectly from how I see it. Um, that you've got the red part, the green part, and then the blue part. And there's different shades in the red and the blue part, but not different categories.
And so for those that are able to see, because I'm gonna put this on
Are
YouTube
you
as
going to call me
well.
out with a
But
photo of
here
a
is
rainbow? Oh,
Yeah. No, this is so this is what you put in the dissertation as well, right? So these are what you are saying are the basic color terms of Old West Norse.
Yeah, and then I'm also showing a couple languages, mostly American Indian languages that have
Mhm.
similar, although nothing is exactly identical, but similar breakdowns.
Okay.
So
Uh, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
like in Guambiano, Buglere, and Kamano Cafe, there you see they also have a term that's focused on yellow but extended to other non-red warm colors. So that's basically, I was just looking for some real world equivalent to what I'm saying that Old Norse does with Blaker, because it sounds, again, sort of alien to English, but it is done in other languages. Or you have a category like that.
Anything interesting that you found about any of the other colors? Like, what about gray?
Gray,
This.
gray is pretty clearly a basic color term. They talk about it often. Um, it's probably the color term that comes up the most in just natural descriptions. I mean, the world is kind of gray in that part of the world. Um, I think part of what's interesting is that you have a basic term, gror, modern Icelandic graur, um, modern Norwegian gro, etc., that is sort of used by default, but then there's a couple other sort of subterms that are used for particular reference. So there's hor, which is, I don't know, it's like a cow, which is gray haired. Right? That's related to English hoary, Hoary. So, for example, in
Hmm.
the Eddic poem, Horbarsljóð, Hárbarsljóð, that's the song of gray beard, right? Horbarsljóð. Um, and then there's the term hus, modern aesthetic hus, which is the gray of a wolf. So that tends to be what's used to suggest a more wolfish color. Those aren't basic terms; they're still within the gray purview, but they're specialized grays. You know, we have also specialized terms in English too. You know, horses are a domain where people use a lot of special terms that they wouldn't use about other things, right? Chestnut, bay, roan, buckskin. In my part of the world, all of these mean different things that you wouldn't call something other than a horse that color. Right? So we do tend to have sort of specialized terms in languages like that. Um, Human hair is another domain where you have a lot of specialized terms. Right? Blonde is not something you would typically say of something other than human
Yeah.
hair. Um, Chestnut, maybe, I guess people would say about human hair, just like horsehair, but I don't think you would say roan of human hair. That'd be kind of interesting. Um, so there are special domains where people focus on color a lot: human hair, horsehair, and apparently wolf hair, where you're going to get more specialized terms. But for a term to be basic, we have to expect that it will be applied to new things. So if I show you, well, I mean, just something I have handy, like here's this oil bottle.
Mm.
I mean, if I ask you what, use the most basic color term you can for that, what would you use? Yeah.
Yellow.
But if this was somebody's hair, I'd probably call it blonde, right? So, but you wouldn't just apply blonde to like something you haven't seen yet.
No,
So
exactly.
the basic terms are the ones you're going to apply to new things. And in the gray category, they're not applying hor and hus to new things. Those are being applied only to a particular reference. So it has to be psychologically salient enough that it comes up when somebody's describing something new, which can be sort of hard to control for, obviously, when your sources are literary. But when you have enough thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of words to work with, um, just frequency gives you a big clue as to what is more basic and what's not. And in that dissertation, I created pie charts that show relative frequency of color terms. Part of what's astonishing in Old Norse is that red is something like 1/3 of all color ever mentioned. People bleed so much.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a lot of violent stories. So a lot of bleeding,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of talk about gold. And so red just is this massive part of the pie chart of what colors are ever mentioned. Um,
That is very interesting.
yeah, and then of course you get a fair amount of black, white, blue, green, blaker, the combined yellow, pinkish, um, gray. If I didn't say that, brown, some. But then beyond that, it trails way, way, way off.
So brown is its own category as well. It's not like a, a type of red or a.
I think brown is actually still probably part of the black basic color term. Um,
Okay.
so there's an interesting thing that goes on in languages, this phenomenon called type modification, though, where if you need to contrast the color of something, you use a more basic term than is actually applicable. So the most obvious instance of this in English is wine. So red wines are not red, typically. White wines are not white, right? But nobody talks about purple and yellow wines.
Yeah.
Um, or to use even less basic terms, wheat colored and I don't know, hyacinth colored wines or something like that. We use
Yeah.
really, really basic terms. So typically, if you're using color to categorize rather than describe, you use a more basic term. Um, that could be what's going on when they call brown eyes black, because you don't read about brown eyes in Old Norse. So I have to assume that means that black eyes means brown for the most part. Um, and there's also still some residual evidence that brown is included in black from um, maybe the fact that black horses in Icelandic are still typically called brown unless they're like 100% like every single hair is black. Um, so I don't know. I'm a little more on the fence about brown. They talk about it enough, but it sometimes seems that in categorization, brown is subsumed under black. So brown is either a kind of black that's beginning to emerge as a basic color term, or it has sort of like recently emerged in Old Norse as a basic color term. I'm not sure that I'm not sure whether I came up with exactly where I fell on this question. Um, clearly, a basic color term in the modern Scandinavian languages, um, and even in Old Norse, there's some contextual reference specific terms like jarpur is used of brown human hair, but you don't use it of anything else, which is kind of interesting because in modern Icelandic it's only used of horsehair. So it's gone from being a special human hair term to being a special horsehair term. It's kind of fun.
And over the years, has there been any changes that you think? I mean, looking back at your dissertation, that was
Mm.
2014, so a little while ago. I mean, are there any? Is there anything that, looking back, you would add to it or take away?
When I initially proposed it, I was going to try to figure out the basic color terms of modern Icelandic, Faroese, and Norwegian to see if I could create a sequence to compare against the Berlin and K sequence. But to do research on living subjects, which it's considered if you ask people questions about how they use their language, I needed all these permits and whatever, and the Old Norse question was a big enough one. I did a little bit of research
Yeah.
at the same time on modern Icelandic color terms because my advisor had, and I disagreed with my advisor about one question in modern Icelandic, which was the basic color term for purple. Old Norse has no basic color term for purple, it's included under blue. But modern Icelandic does have a basic color term for purple, and mostly what I find Icelanders say is fjolublau. So fjola being the plant violet, and then blue. So violet blue is it's a basic color term even though it's a compound. Um, she disagreed and thought that it was rødblau, like a compound of red and blue, or was it blau
Mm.
there? I can't remember. But I didn't find anybody who really said that. So that was kind of my hot take on modern Icelandic color terms, was that actually, yeah, there is a purple color term, but it's not what's been stated to be the purple color term. So maybe if I had had just infinite time, I would have done more stuff with the modern languages too. But as it was, I felt like I had enough of a point that I made. and I sort of moved on. Um, Although I've remained uh, fairly persuaded by my own research, and I've certainly been happy to talk to people about it since. And I think that it's opened my eyes to some other interesting questions about what I would call sort of linguistic taxonomy. What terms are included under the categories that we use in languages? So an example of that is uh, fish, right? So what is the linguistic
Mhm.
taxonomy of the word fish? What's included when you say a fish, right? So just like with colors, you have a focal thing, like your focal thing when you hear fish, like what do you think about? It's probably something like a goldfish or a trout or something like that. But there might be things that are kind of at
Right.
the edges of the category, and those may really, really differ from language to language. Like is an eel a fish? Um, you know,
A
right?
whale.
Because in the 19th century, a whale is still definitely a fish by linguistic taxonomy, if not by biological taxonomy, just from the way people talk about it, right? Um, in Moby Dick, for example. So linguistic taxonomy
Yeah.
is kind of an interesting question, and I think that it's a field of semantics that's a little bit underexplored. It's a little tough to explore, but a little bit underexplored in extinct languages, right? What is included in categories like fish or even human, right? Um, or God, right? I think this can intersect in interesting ways with religious and mythological studies. Uh, so this stuff interests me to a degree. I haven't published about it much since my dissertation days, since I've never been on any kind of tenure track position and never had a realistic shot at such a position. I sort of just stopped publishing articles much because they don't do much for me in my particular vocational direction.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask you just because I really thank you for talking to us about color and your research in it. But what are you doing now? Like, what's something that you're working on, or some recent publications that you could tell the people listening to
Well,
check out?
currently, um, I was an untenured full time instructor at different universities for most of the last decade. I taught at UCLA, then at Berkeley, and then at Colorado. I quit Colorado in 2020, um, and since then I've been fully supported just by my weird public education efforts. So I patched together a living from making YouTube videos, from my published books, from some voice acting, from some video game film consulting, from just like it's a wedding officiating. Like I just have this huge patchwork of things that I put together into a living. But my main pursuits are I put out two full length videos on YouTube every week. I've increasingly
Mhm.
done shorts, although not on any kind of regular schedule on YouTube and Instagram, um, which I get some advertising money from, and YouTube pushes those so much now that they get a lot of the sort of traffic to the YouTube channel. I have four translations of different Old Norse texts out, or rather, three translations and one combined edition and translation. It's the Wanderer's Hall of All. And then I'm working on a textbook for self study in Old Norse to help people learn how to read Old Norse to be used either on your own or in a classroom. Um,
Fantastic.
yeah, it's been an interesting challenge. What I keep telling people who ask me when is this going to be done, you've been talking about it forever, is that with translation, 30 minutes is a meaningful amount of time. I can sit down and work on translating for 30 minutes. With creating a language textbook, 30 minutes is like enough time to remember what I did yesterday, because you're
Right.
building this house of cards and trying to sequence things correctly and what have you. And I've started and stopped that so many times. Then I had kind of a you know, personal disaster of a year in 2023, which slowed everything down. But my my main pursuits right now are, yeah, just keeping the videos going, working on that book, um, and just trying to find some new opportunities and things like voice acting and wedding officiating and that kind of stuff, just to try to patch together uh, more of a living. I make a lot more, which isn't bragging. It's just a sad fact. YouTube, just Patreon, right? The donations to that YouTube
Yeah.
channel provide me with a much better living than teaching anywhere ever did. Um, and since there was nowhere to advance in these untenured jobs, it was just sort of like work forever doing the same thing. I
Yeah.
decided to quit that and focus on something where the harder I worked, the more I made. At least that was true for a while. Um, so it's weird, but it's a weird thing to try to make a living off of. Period. Um, so
It's a niche subject.
I mean, sort of, right? It's pretty
Mhm.
popular. The thing is, you just have to find those people because they're not all getting together in one place. Um, there's no, it's you're not going to sell out a stadium talking about Norse myth, maybe, but if you could get everybody together who was interested in it, you could definitely sell out a stadium. Uh, sometimes it really surprises people. I mean, I think in 2021, I think 80,000 of my books sold. Right? I mean, that's ridiculous when you consider that they're translations of Old Norse stuff. Um,
Yeah.
People are really
1,000 years
into
old.
this. It's just a question of finding them, getting that material to them, because they don't all congregate in one place. Well, maybe they congregate in Reykjavik in the summer to a certain extent.
Yeah. 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 Well, I mean, even though you changed directions and are no longer in like the institutionalized academia, you're still absolutely, I mean, making an impact, of course, with the content that you put out and making the material public. You're still reaching the masses, if anything, at a probably to a larger extent. You're able to reach the masses and teach
Maybe I don't know. Uh,
while doing this.
you um, I don't have a great sense of what impact or not that I have. I have a great community on Patreon of people who are very supportive and obviously keep all of this going with their donations every month. Um, but I don't have any great sense of what larger impact, if any, I might have made. Um, the impact that I'm trying to have is just to have good information out there in a neutral way, right? Part of what I think distinguishes what I'm trying to do from a lot of other people trying to talk about this stuff online is that I'm not trying to sell a lifestyle of any kind to you. Um,
Hmm.
I'm not Uh, I'm not a pagan. I'm not trying to convert you to the worship of Norse gods, and I'm not trying to sell you on some kind of particular political ideology or other ideology. I just want to share information with you, and I think that neutrality is valuable because I think too often people feel like they have to identify with what they're interested in, but I also am pretty pretty obvious about the fact that I don't, identify myself as a Viking or something, right? I have my
Right.
own
Yeah.
culture that I'm part of. Um, I think people sometimes see my personal quote brand as something, silly or odd or something, the cowboy hats or whatever. I mean, heck, I just dealt with this. I married a couple in in Colorado here on Saturday as we're talking, and the groom's dad was from Florida, and he was you know, really questioning how seriously anybody could wear a cowboy hat. It's like, buddy, look around you. there's a lot. There's a
Yeah.
lot of this around this part of the world, so take it easy on that. Um, but to me, it's also kind of important to say, like, look, I'm my own person. Like, I'm not trying to say, like, I'm not a guru. I'm not trying to sell a lifestyle to you because it's not even my lifestyle. I'm just curious about
Hmm.
another time that I spent a lot of time learning about and teaching about, and now I'm trying to share information that you can take and do what you want with. Um, but I want you to have the right information, or at least potentially the right information. Obviously, you can disagree with how I interpret it. Um, you can
Absolutely.
look at my, in fact, you can look at my publicly available dissertation, for example, and look at all of the color terms in Old Norse and come to totally different conclusions from me. That's fine. I think the data is more important than the theory.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time today to talk about all this. It was very interesting, and I was super excited to do this. And I hope to have you back on the podcast
That
sometime.
sounds fun. And thank you very much for your time and also for the invitation.
Yeah, of course.